Ever wondered what tunes got medieval people dancing? Did kings and peasants rock out to the same beats? Was medieval music actually good or just plain weird to our modern ears? Number 5. The haunting sound of the hurdy-gurdy. Have you ever seen a musical instrument that looks like a cross between a violin and a hand-cranked coffee grinder? That's the hurdy-gurdy for you. This strange-looking contraption was super popular during medieval times and created some of the most distinctive sounds of the era. The hurdy-gurdy is basically a mechanical string instrument that produces sound when a player turns a crank. This crank rotates a wooden wheel that rubs against strings, kind of like a violin bow that never stops moving. The coolest part. Players could press keys with their other hand to change notes, making it one of the first keyboard string instruments in Europe. Back in medieval times, these instruments were often huge and needed two people to play them, one person to crank and another to work the keys. Can you imagine trying to coordinate that during a performance? Talk about teamwork. Later versions became smaller and more portable, allowing wandering musicians to carry their hurdy-gurdies from town to town, spreading music throughout medieval Europe. The hurdy-gurdy's sound is incredibly unique. It has this continuous drone quality that's almost hypnotic. It's like listening to bagpipes but with strings instead of pipes. This droning quality made it perfect for accompanying dancing or storytelling at medieval gatherings. Interestingly, the hurdy-gurdy wasn't just for commoners. In the 12th and 13th centuries, these instruments appeared in sculptures at major cathedrals like Santiago de Compostela in Spain, showing angels playing them. Imagine that, an instrument so important it was depicted in the hands of heavenly beings. By the late medieval period, the hurdy-gurdy had found its way into royal courts, with fancy versions decorated with intricate carvings and precious materials. The instrument's popularity waxed and waned throughout history, but during the medieval period, it was absolutely essential to the sound of European music. Its distinctive drone provided the backbone for many compositions, creating that atmospheric, somewhat otherworldly quality we now associate with medieval music. When you hear a hurdy-gurdy today, you're experiencing a sound that has remained relatively unchanged for nearly 1,000 years. How many things in our world can claim that kind of consistency? Number 4. The versatile lute, medieval pop star's best friend. What was the guitar hero of the Middle Ages? The lute, hands down. This pear-shaped stringed instrument wasn't just popular, it was absolutely everywhere in medieval Europe. The lute first arrived in Europe through Islamic Spain and spread like wildfire across the continent. With its rounded back made from strips of wood and a flat front with a decorative sound hole, the lute was both beautiful to look at and versatile to play. Musicians would pluck its strings with their fingers or a plectrum, an early version of a guitar pick, creating sounds that could be either soft and romantic or lively and danceable. Medieval lutes typically had 4 or 5 courses, pairs of strings tuned to the same note, unlike the many more courses added during the Renaissance period. This simpler design created a clearer, less complex sound that defined medieval music. The instrument was particularly popular among troubadours and minstrels, the medieval equivalent of today's singer-songwriters, who used lutes to accompany their tales of chivalry, unrequited love, and heroic deeds. Here's something wild: medieval lute players were basically the rock stars of their day. They traveled from castle to castle, entertaining nobles and spreading the latest musical trends. The famous 14th century poet and composer Guillaume de Machaut often featured the lute in his compositions, cementing its status as the cool instrument everyone wanted to learn. The lute wasn't just for professional musicians, though. Wealthy merchant families would often have lutes in their homes for entertainment, and young noble ladies were frequently taught to play as part of their education. Imagine medieval Instagram if it existed. It would be full of lute selfies and lute-alife hashtags. The sound of the medieval lute was brighter and more percussive than its later Renaissance descendants. Players would use techniques like strumming patterns that created rhythmic accompaniments for songs and dances. This gave medieval music that distinctive plucky quality that you can still hear in modern recreations of pieces from the period. What made the lute especially important was its flexibility. It could accompany a solo singer in an intimate chamber setting, join other instruments in an ensemble, or even star in instrumental solos. This versatility helped establish many of the musical structures and harmonies that would eventually evolve into the classical music we know today. And get this, we know exactly what some medieval lute music sounded like because it was actually written down. The earliest surviving lute music dates from the 14th century, giving musicians today a direct connection to the sounds of the Middle Ages. When modern lutenists play these pieces on historically accurate instruments, we're hearing almost exactly what medieval people heard over 700 years ago. How incredible is that? Number 3, the recorder, not just for elementary school kids. Think recorders are just those plastic torture devices that elementary school kids blow into? Think again. In medieval times, the recorder was a sophisticated, professional instrument that produced some of the most beautiful music of the era. Medieval recorders were handcrafted wooden instruments with a whistle-like mouthpiece and 7 or 8 finger holes. Unlike their plastic descendants, these instruments were often made from a single piece of boxwood, maple, or fruit woods, carefully hollowed out and precisely tuned. The craftsmanship was so detailed that some surviving medieval recorders show decorative carvings or inlaid designs. These weren't toys but serious instruments for serious musicians. The recorder's popularity in medieval times came down to one big advantage: its incredible range. Players could produce both soft, delicate melodies perfect for indoor chamber music and louder, more penetrating sounds for outdoor festivities. This versatility made recorders essential instruments in most medieval musical settings. Here's a fun fact: medieval recorders came in different sizes that covered various pitch ranges, much like a modern recorder family. Musicians would often play in consorts, groups of recorders of different sizes, to create rich, harmonious sounds. Imagine a medieval band with tiny soprano recorders playing alongside massive bass recorders nearly 5 feet long. The sound of a medieval recorder is surprisingly complex. Unlike the sometimes shrill sound of a modern plastic recorder, period instruments made from wood have a warm, rounded tone with a distinctive breathy quality. This sound blended beautifully with voices and other instruments, making recorders perfect for both secular and sacred music. Speaking of sacred music, recorders frequently appeared in church and cathedral settings. Medieval religious paintings often show angels playing recorders, suggesting these instruments were considered worthy of heavenly music. Court records from throughout Europe mention recorder players among the musicians employed by nobility, showing how valued these instrumentalists were. Unlike many medieval instruments that required years of training, recorders were relatively accessible to amateur musicians too. This meant that while professional recorder virtuosos certainly existed, many ordinary people could also enjoy making music on simpler versions of the instrument. Tavern gatherings, family celebrations, and community festivals would often include recorder music played by local musicians. The recorder's fingerhole system allowed for playing both simple folk tunes and complex polyphonic music, multiple melody lines played simultaneously. This technical capability made recorders essential to the development of medieval musical styles that emphasized interwoven melodic lines rather than chord-based harmonies. When you hear a skilled musician play a historically accurate medieval recorder today, you're experiencing something remarkably close to what people heard centuries ago. The instrument's fundamental design hasn't changed much, allowing us a direct sonic connection to the Middle Ages that few other instruments can provide. Doesn't that make you look at those elementary school recorders with a bit more respect? Number 2, the mysterious sound of the medieval fiddle. Did people really rock out to violin music in the Middle Ages? Not exactly, but they did have the medieval fiddle, and it was absolutely everywhere. The medieval fiddle, also called a vielle, looked kind of like a violin's awkward ancestor. With its rounded body, flat back, and typically 5 strings, it was held either under the chin like a modern violin or vertically against the chest or shoulder. Some versions even had drone strings that sounded continuously while the player bowed the melody strings, creating a rich, layered sound that defined medieval string music. Unlike today's standardized violins, medieval fiddles came in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Some had rounded bodies, others were oval or even rectangular. The sound holes, the openings that let sound escape from the instrument's body, could be C-shaped, D-shaped, or decorative patterns like roses or stars. This variety meant that each fiddle had its own unique sound character, making medieval string ensembles incredibly diverse in their tonal colors. Here's where it gets really interesting. Medieval fiddle players didn't use sheet music the way modern violinists do. Instead, many played by ear and improvised extensively, adapting their playing to suit the moment and audience. This improvisation was a central feature of medieval music performance. Imagine a medieval fiddler jamming at a feast, responding to dancers and other musicians in real time. The fiddle's versatility made it a favorite for accompanying both secular songs and instrumental dance music. Medieval artwork frequently shows fiddlers playing for dancers or performing alongside singers. The famous Cantigas de Santa Maria, a collection of songs from 13th century Spain, features numerous illustrations of fiddle players performing in various settings, giving us a visual record of how these instruments were used. We know from historical accounts that fiddles were played by everyone from humble street musicians to highly paid court performers. In fact, royal courts throughout Europe employed dedicated fiddle players who were paid quite well for their services. The English royal court records from 1285 mention a payment to King Edward's fiddler, showing how even monarchs appreciated good fiddle playing. The sound of a medieval fiddle differs substantially from a modern violin. The gut strings literally made from animal intestines, and the flatter bridge created a warmer, less penetrating tone than today's instruments. When played with a medieval bow shorter and more curved than modern bows, the fiddle produced a distinctive buzz that modern listeners might initially find strange, but that medieval ears would have found completely normal and pleasing. Since bowed string instruments exist in cultures worldwide, the medieval fiddle represented a technological innovation that connected Europe to broader musical traditions across Asia and North Africa. Trade routes brought musical influences along with goods, and the medieval fiddle evolved partly through these cross-cultural exchanges. Some historians believe certain playing techniques came to Europe via the Byzantine Empire and Islamic lands, showing how medieval music was part of a global conversation. When modern musicians recreate medieval fiddle music on historically accurate instruments, they're reviving sounds that haven't been commonly heard for centuries. The distinctive drone quality, the buzzing resonance, and the modal rather than major or minor melodies transport listeners directly to medieval marketplaces, castle halls, and village celebrations. Isn't it amazing how a few pieces of wood and some strings can build a time machine to the distant past? Number 1, the powerhouse of medieval sound, the portative organ. Ever seen a keyboard instrument small enough to carry around? The medieval portative organ was exactly that, a miniature, portable version of the massive church organs we know today. And it produced some of the most distinctive sounds in medieval music. The portative organ consisted of a single rank of pipes attached to a small keyboard, all designed to be small and light enough for a musician to carry with one hand while playing with the other. Inside this compact miracle of medieval engineering was a tiny bellows that the player would pump to push air through the pipes while pressing keys to create melodies. Talk about medieval multitasking. What made the portative organ special wasn't just its portability, but its remarkably clear, pure tone. The sound of these instruments cut through other musical textures like a laser, making them perfect for playing important melody lines. This distinctive sound became so associated with medieval music that when we hear it today, it immediately transports us back to that era. The portative organ appeared throughout medieval Europe from the 12th century onward, featured prominently in manuscripts, paintings, and sculptures from the period. One of the most famous depictions appears in the Psalter of Queen Mary, showing a musician playing the instrument alongside other medieval favorites like the harp and fiddle. These visual records help modern instrument makers recreate historically accurate versions of these fascinating instruments. Unlike the massive church organs that required specialists to maintain and play them, portative organs were relatively democratic instruments. Court musicians, wandering performers, and even wealthy amateurs could own and play them. This accessibility helped spread specific musical styles and compositions throughout medieval Europe, creating something of a common musical language across the continent. The portative organ was particularly valued for religious processions and outdoor ceremonies where a regular organ wouldn't be practical. Imagine a medieval religious procession winding through narrow city streets with a portative organ player providing the sacred music to accompany the movement. The instrument's distinctive sound would have floated above the crowd, creating an atmosphere of reverence and celebration. Some medieval portative organs had as few as 8 keys, while others extended to 2 full octaves. This range limitation meant that composers had to be creative in writing music for the instrument, focusing on expressive melodies rather than wide-ranging musical lines. This constraint actually helped develop the distinctive character of medieval music, with its emphasis on modal melodies that stay within a relatively narrow range. Here's something fascinating. The technology behind the portative organ represented some of the most advanced engineering of the medieval period. The precise measurements required to create properly tuned pipes, the mechanical linkages between keys and valves, and the design of efficient bellows, all these elements showcased medieval craftsmanship at its finest. These instruments weren't just musical tools, but demonstrations of the period's technological capabilities. When modern musicians perform on reconstructed portative organs, they're connecting directly to this medieval technological tradition. The sound they produce, clear, somewhat nasal, and unmistakably medieval to our ears, hasn't fundamentally changed in over 800 years. Isn't that an incredible thought? The same distinctive tones that accompanied medieval processions, dances, and ceremonies can still be experienced today, virtually unchanged by the centuries. So what did medieval music really sound like? Was it completely alien to our modern ears, or would we recognize something familiar in these ancient melodies? Would you enjoy a medieval concert if you could time travel back to experience one firsthand?